let's start to talk about racial trauma. So the intersection of race and trauma. Well, we need to appreciate that chronic racial stress can cause trauma. So we know that the kinds of things that can overwhelm our thinking and feeling and become trauma are an extreme dramatic event, a singular extreme dramatic event, a chronic serious events, and even chronic minor events can over time overwhelm our capacity, right? Well, chronic racial stress certainly causes trauma. And when we think about the historical racial trauma that people of African descent have experienced, from colonialism to enslavement to segregation to poverty to criminalization to even being subjected to racial name calling and racial violence, and even the kind of things that we call microaggressions today. These kinds of race traumas, these kinds of racial experiences can create trauma. We do know that historical racial trauma can be transmitted intergenerationally. And I think our Indigenous brothers and sisters have helped us to understand that, as we have seen the effect of colonialism on Indigenous populations and the effect of the residential schools on Indigenous families. So if we can understand that race can be traumatic, then when we are treating people who are racialized, we must treat the racism and its effects alongside the trauma. And this requires a high degree of cultural competence on the part of the clinician. When we think about the historical racial trauma suffered by Black people, we think about colonialism, enslavement, torture, brutality, lynching, continuing discrimination and marginalization. All of these are forms of state-sanctioned violence against Black people. This trauma has been communicated through the generations through two processes. So when we talk about intergenerational trauma, we need to appreciate that intergenerational trauma gets transmitted in two ways: through social learning and through epigenetics. Now, social learning is kind of maybe a little easier to understand, because we know that if my great-grandmother experienced tremendous violence and brutality, then she learned to express herself through brutality and violence. And so she raised my grandmother with brutality and violence. So my grandmother then learned to communicate and parent with brutality and violence. And she raised my mother. So my mother learned to communicate through, you get the picture. So now I am a third generation sufferer of my great-grandmother's trauma, because we have learned violence in my family. Right? The other way, though, that this historical trauma, this gets transmitted down through the generations, is through epigenetics. And our time in this segment doesn't permit me to digest epigenetics or to explain it in great detail, but I'll try, if you'll let me, I'll try to, I'm just going to throw a little whiteboard up here for a moment. In a real quick description, there are mechanisms in our body that control how we respond to stress and trauma. If this is our brain up here, we have the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. And then down here, if I were to draw just these kidneys here, these two triangular shaped hats that sit above our kidneys, these are our adrenal glands. And these three organs control our stress response system, and it's called the HPA axis. And basically, when we are experiencing the world, these three organs are in communication with each other, and they tell us when to get ready for flight or fight. Right? Yeah. And of course, we know that there's also fleeing and fawning and freezing. That's a part of this process, but I'm not going to get too complicated here. So basically, something happens in our environment. The hypothalamus interprets it as a threat, sends a message to the pituitary gland that says, threat alert, that sends messages to our adrenal glands, and our body starts producing adrenaline and cortisol. And now we're ready for flight, fight, fleeing, fawning, freezing. Well, if you think about it, that system is a chemically driven system. It involves chemistry, and it even involves the electrical system in our bodies, and our muscles, and even our brain in terms of interpreting threats. And this is a very finely tuned system. And if you can think about it, if my great-grandmother had her gauges, which are supposed to be finely tuned, you know, if you think about it, this finely tuned gauge, if she grew up in perpetual violence and threat, then her gauge could be miscalibrated. And she can actually give birth to my grandmother, who now has a gauge that is miscalibrated from birth. And so her system of responding to threat is already, before she's even experienced herself violence and threat, her system of responding to violence and threat has been miscalibrated. And then she gives birth to my mother, who has a gauge that's even more upset. So then there's poor me. I come out of the womb, and my body is already, my system is already miscalibrated. So I'm misinterpreting threats, overreacting, in a chronic state of disequilibrium, too much cortisol, too much adrenaline in my body and my blood. And it's all because my great-grandmother had her HPA axis miscalibrated, and she's passed that down epigenetically to my grandmother and to my mother and to me. So that's the second way that trauma can be translated down through the generations. It helps us to understand how our trauma, our contemporary lived trauma, is affected by and flavored by and compounded by our historical trauma. So, just like the person who is driving down the highway and his car fishtails, and he is reminded of the accident he had years ago and is now responding as if he's reliving that trauma, a person of African descent, a Black person, can be experiencing a contemporary trauma, and if it resonates and is similar to the historical trauma of my people, then I am reacting as if those ancient atrocities are occurring to me in the present time. Which means that what might seem to other people as a minor harm or offense might actually cause me deep harm and drive me into deep crisis, because it is triggering ancient dramatic harms that my people have suffered through enslavement, through colonization, through the brutality of racism and segregation during the very dark period of our history. And again, it will require very deep cultural competence to treat a Black person whose contemporary traumas are resonating and bringing up ancient historical racial traumas. And I say here that it's going to be important not only that culturally competent therapists have the skills to do that, but in order for them to have the trust of Black people to be welcomed into helping them heal their trauma, they must demonstrate their allyship by being well-informed and extremely active anti-racist practitioners. So I say it is not enough to simply know about racial trauma. You must be active and visible in the community, actively working to address the systems of racism that have historically and contemporarily oppress Black people, if you're going to be welcomed into the space of helping Black people with their trauma. So when I talk about cultural competence, what am I talking about? So what I'm saying is that in addition to all of the knowledge about trauma that a person needs to be a competent trauma therapist, they also need to have deep capacities in cultural competence if they're going to help a Black person work with their racial trauma. So, cultural competence, for the purposes of this conversation, I say consists of 5 principal capacities. The ability to understand your own cultural position and how it differs from other people's. The ability to understand the different socio-cultural realities in which we all live and work. Right? So what I like to say about that is that, I live in a neighborhood, and let's say my neighbor across the street lives in a house that's exactly like mine. And let's say that the neighbor who lives across the street has a job that's just like mine, and we work in the same office. Let's say we drive the same cars. Let's say we have the same diet. Let's say that for all intents and purposes, my neighbor's life is parallel to mine, except for the fact that they're white and I'm black. Well, from the time we walk out of our doors and make our way to the workplace, work in that office, and return, to understand this concept, we need to understand that though our lives are so similar, we have lived completely different experiences that day. Let's say we traveled by bus to work, and I had an experience of sitting on my bus seat and having multiple people pass me and choose not to sit with me. Let's say that I've had, we both went to a newsstand to get a magazine or a newspaper, and I was twice passed over to be served by the person attending the newsstand because a white person got their newspaper ahead of me, even though I was first in line. Right? Let's say you see what I'm saying, that the experiences that we have as a function of race, we live in very different social realities. We also need to cultivate appropriate attitudes towards cultural difference if we want to be truly culturally competent. So for example, I hear people frequently out loud making negative comments about immigration and its effects on our society. And they think that, a lot of people think that that's just a political opinion. Well, a racialized person might experience that comment as racist because, we're not really complaining about Norwegians moving to Canada, are we? We're talking about people from South and Central America and from Asia and from Africa. And to a racialized person, that kind of comment has overt racial tones. We also need to generate and interpret a variety of verbal and nonverbal responses and cultivate the ability to talk about cultural difference in race and across cultural differences in race. And we also need to understand structural oppression and commit to social justice. Those are the 5 principles that really make up cultural competence. And I'm arguing that to be a culturally competent trauma therapist for a Black person, you need all the skills of the trauma therapist and all these skills of cultural competence. So what does that mean in terms of treating racial trauma? Well, we need to acknowledge race as an issue and that racial dynamics will exist when we are treating a person who's Black. We need to be able to review the context and the substance of the contemporary crisis that the client is experiencing and be able to put a racial lens on the contemporary experience. We need to be able to review the feelings and the meaning of the contemporary crisis, also from a race lens. Okay? So when a person is describing what has happened to them, we need to be able to, as a therapist, say, okay, what does that mean? How would a Black person make meaning of that experience? How would a Black person feel about that experience? What are the racial elements of how this person is processing this experience? We also need to be able to explore connections between historical racial trauma and the contemporary crisis. So if you're dealing with a client, for example, who has experienced chronic maltreatment on the job and has been traumatized by that, we need to say, well, that really sucks. This person is on the job and they've been chronically subjected to microaggressions and maltreatment. But now we've got to say we're not only dealing with that contemporary trauma, but that trauma has probably activated the historical racial trauma that this person has experienced. And so we're going to have to unpack all of that historical racial trauma if we're going to treat this person who is in your office, basically because they've had a racial incident on the job. Okay. So the job will be a lot bigger than it might appear at first. Okay. So that's the second section where we're trying to talk about race and trauma. And I did see one question.
Yes, Robert, we did have one of the attendees ask if we circle back to that epigenetics example that you used, is there a way to recalibrate those systems, obviously taking into account the systemic cultural change that's needed as well, but is there a way to change that fight or flight response that that historical trauma has its effect on people?
Yes, it is possible. It's amazing to me how delicate our hormonal and enzymatic system is in our body. My first real world example of this is when I went to my doctor and I said, you know, I just wanted to check up, and he wanted to get a baseline on me and so forth. And he said to me, how much do you drink? And I said, I don't drink at all. He says, yeah, okay. How much is that? I said, well, not at all. He says, okay, yeah, that's like, is that like 1 drink a month or is it 2 drinks? I said, no, I don't drink at all. And he kind of shrugged and said, okay. And he, you know, sent me for a battery of tests. And when it came back, he said, looking at my liver function, you don't drink at all, do you? And I said, yeah, that's what I said. He said, oh, no. In the doctor's office, people who will have 1 beer on a weekend or maybe 2 glasses of wine in a month always say that they don't drink. And I said, are you meaning to tell me that you can tell by my liver function if I have 1 beer a month? He said, oh yeah, absolutely. So if you think about it, if 1 beer a month can have an effect on my enzymatic system, right? The system is very responsive to how we treat it. So if we're a person who has a miscalibrated HPA, right, then if for us to recalibrate it, we would have to discipline ourselves to create for ourselves a low reactive environment. You know? We could treat ourselves to periods of time when we have such limited stimulus that we actually give our system an opportunity to heal. Right? So, for example, if anybody's ever been in a float tank with these sensory deprivation kinds of circumstances, right, in a float tank, that you don't only feel good when you're in the float tank, you can feel good for days after being in the float tank. Why? Because you have given your entire system a break from the reactivity that is so much a large part of our life. So I would say you can recalibrate your HPA axis by meditation, by exercise, by taking advantage of float tanks, by carving out in your world time. And some people feel like, well, that's really too bad, because I see my friend over here and he can burn the candle from both ends and sleep for 4 hours and get up and be functional the following day. Well, if your HPA axis is miscalibrated, you can't do that. You don't have the luxury. You must get your 8 hours or 9 hours or 10 hours of sleep every single night if you're going to be non-hyper reactive the following day. Right? So you can, over time, adjust your HPA. Sometimes when people ask me, well, how long does it take? I'd say, well, you know that you can change your blood pressure by virtue of environmental changes. Change your diet, change your behavior, change your outlook, and you can change your blood pressure. It ain't easy, but it does take tremendous discipline. Yeah, but it can be recalibrated.